Hey everyone, welcome to Confident Conversations. Today we're going to talk about how you say no. So here's the scenario. It's a regular day. You're moving along, checking things off your to-do list, and suddenly your boss comes in and asks for something. Can you get me that report? Yes. Then somebody else calls and says, can you contact the customer today? Yes. Can you help me do this thing and that thing and this other thing, until suddenly your day is filled with things that were not even on your to-do list and not on your calendar, which also has to get done. My guest today, Sara Holtz, is going to help you figure out exactly what to say and how to say it so you can protect your time and say yes to the things that really matter to you. I'm Melissa Hereford. I'm the founder of Negotiate with Confidence, and I'm so excited to talk with my guest today, Sara Holtz. Sara spent her career as a lawyer and a woman in the C-suite. As a C-suite executive, she was often the only woman in the room. And she says it was pretty lonely, and oftentimes it was hard to find other women to talk to and to turn to for advice when dealing with these challenging things that come up every day at work. So Sara is such a go-getter. She went out and started a very amazing and full of information podcast that is called Advice to My Younger Me. And this podcast, she interviews other women who are in the same situation, and the advice that she gets and gives will help you and help women navigate this sometimes confusing workplace. So her guests share the advice that they wish they'd gotten earlier in their careers to help them navigate the workplace more effectively. And Sara interviewed me in episode 47 of the Advice to My Younger Me podcast. So Sara, I'm so excited to talk to you and to welcome you to Confident Conversations.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to see you. So let's start from the beginning. I know we're all dying to hear. Why is it important for us to be able to say no?
Well, something I think we don't think about enough is whenever we say yes to something, we're actually saying no to something else. You know, we all have only 24 hours in every day. And every time that we say yes, like to the boss's request to get that report or to call the customer or whatever, we're saying no to something else, which is maybe on our to-do list, or maybe in the broader scheme, something which is really important to us in terms of the success of our careers. And so we need to recognize that we don't have a limitless capacity to say yes to things and still do those things which are important to us, which are critical to our career success, which are our goals. And they may not even be career related. They may be like, I want to get home and have dinner with my family every night. That's an important value to me. And when you say yes to every incoming request that you have, then you're making the possibility of that other thing, which is really important to you, not happen.
Yes, that is, yes. That is true. And we have a comment from Serena who says, this is a great thing to remember. Saying yes to something is saying no to something else. And I think it's really powerful what you just said, Sara, about we're saying no to things to advance our careers, things that are on our list for our own career advancement and getting ahead at work. We're also saying no to a lot of times our personal lives. So if we want to work out, getting exercise is so important. If we want to see our families, if, family dinner is important to you, those are the kinds of things that we are also saying no to when we say yes to everything.
So I want to say a little something about this. Every time we say yes to something, we're saying no to something else, which might be more important to us, which is, it's really important to know what is important to us. And so I gave the example of having dinner with your family every night. You have to make a conscious decision about what your personal yeses are in your life. And you actually it's a goal setting process. What is it that's important to you, both in terms of your career, in terms of your self-care, in terms of your relationships, in terms of your community? You have to have a really clear vision of what it is that you want in your life so that when you're presented with that request, you can say, how does this meet all those goals that I have? Does it support them, Or is it contrary to them? Or am I saying yes to something that's going to mean that I'm going to have to not do something which I find really important, or which is, core to my being?
So, Sara, talk to us a little bit about this struggle that I know a lot of women have to say that my family is my number one priority, and to be in an executive position where I'm trying to get ahead and advance my career, that can be seen as a weakness. How do we deal with that internal struggle?
Well, I mean, first of all, there are many people who are much more erudite on this than I am about how to manage your time and how to, put your priorities into place. For example, Laura Vanderkam, who wrote the book, I Know How She Does It, or 108 Hours, really talks about the fact that maybe some of these things are false dichotomies and that we can figure out a way to honor both of them. And her point is we waste a lot of time in the day, frankly, with things that are not important to us and that we're not even aware that we're spending time on. And basically, if we're more conscious, more mindful of how the way that we spend our time, we may discover that actually we have more time to spend on the important things in our lives. And again, you have to be really clear about, this goes back to this, every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. There are critical things that are going to help you move ahead in your career. And then there's lots of other things that aren't. And when you get clearer about what it is that is going to move you ahead, or, help you get that promotion or help you get that raise, or whatever your view of success is, that when you get clearer about that, then it's much easier to be able to say, is this a yes project or a no project?
Mm-hmm. I've heard some people, by the way, I will put the books that you recommended into the notes, the tip sheet. For those of you who are watching later and want to download the tip sheet, it'll be up on my website in a few days, and you can get those resources from downloading that tip sheet from Sara. So I've heard that a great way to keep track of the kinds of things that you're doing all day is to just, at least for a few days, keep a log of what you're doing, like a time log, so you can identify those things that aren't productive or aren't on your path to success. If you want to get a promotion, that there are certain activities or certain people you need to connect with. And if you're spending extra time doing things just as a favor for a coworker, or other things that maybe are sucking up your time you're not really aware of, doing a kind of tracking your time sheet can be really helpful. Spending too much time on emails or going to Facebook,
Right.
Those kinds of things can be real black holes for time sucking.
Right.
So once you identify your yeses, and I can imagine I'm sitting there with my boss or a coworker and they're asking me to do something that I really don't have time to do, I know people are going to tune in to hear what you have to say about how to say no, and how to do it in a way where you don't jeopardize the relationship or become seen as a naysayer or someone who's not easy to work with or likable. I think those are what I hear all the time that women struggle with, especially, that if I don't say no in the right way, I'm labeled as someone who's not a team player.
Actually, most people are concerned that if they say no, period, whether it's the right way or the wrong way, it's going to jeopardize the relationship. Wow. So let me make a couple of comments about that. The first thing is that I think that learning to say no is actually a skill. We have to practice it. We have to do it. We have to practice it. We have to practice it in low risk situations so that we're prepared to do it in higher risk situations, whatever. So I call it practicing your no muscle, right?
I love it.
So let me give you some tips about how to not say yes automatically. Because I think for many of us as women, we're very hardwired to be concerned about relationships, and we are hardwired to please people, I think. And so the notion of saying no has kind of a built-in resistance that we have to it. So here's a couple of tips. So the first thing is to not say yes automatically. Recognize that your kind of reflex is to say yes to requests, and to stop yourself from doing that and say things like, I need to think about that, right? Or let me get back to you about that. And then ask yourself, how would you feel? And I'm thinking more about longer term commitments than just somebody say, would you call this customer today? But how would you feel if that request were tomorrow? And I have, because as I always say, eventually it will be tomorrow, right? And I have a story to tell about this. It was many years ago, I was invited to give a speech in Paris, right? And right, exactly. I'm looking at your face like,
I'll be there.
Yes to this speech in Paris. But I had a very full plate. You know, I had kids I was raising. I had a full-time job. It was my own business, so I was always involved in marketing it, all of those kinds of things. But so this person invited me to give this speech in Paris, and I was like, well, of course, right? Now, if you had said to me, would you give a speech in Paris 3 days from now, you know, building in time to travel there, I would have said, are you crazy? I mean, like I'm booked out for the next month, right? But I said yes. And the thing was, when it finally occurred, I really didn't want to do it, even though it was a trip to Paris. It was all expense paid, whatever. It was like 3 days out of my schedule, completely committed. I was on a plane the whole time. I hated it. I didn't actually, you know, my vision when I said yes was, oh, I'll spend a week in Paris and it'll be wonderful, right? But in fact, because of the nature of my schedule, I had to get back. I got right back on a plane and flew back. So I think that I use this as an example because I think it's really important when you're faced with something which is a significant thing, like, will you write this report? Will you go to this client meeting in New York? Whatever it may be, that you say, if it were tomorrow, would I say yes? Mm-hmm. Because eventually it will be tomorrow. And it's so easy to say yes in the future. But the future doesn't look very different than the present. And whatever the constraints would be about doing it tomorrow, those will probably be the same constraints that you'll find, 6 months from now or 3 months from now, whatever. The second piece of advice I have, and we've kind of been talking about this, is to think about it's really important to you that with this request that's being made. Like, is this something which is consistent with your goals, what you're trying to accomplish, all of those kinds of things? Or at the very least, think about whether it's really important to the person who's asking, right, or whether they're just too lazy to do it themselves, or you're the first person they think, to ask to do it. And I have a story I tell about this, which was I had a client who had participated in one of my workshops. And at that workshop, she had written a very detailed business development plan for how she was going to grow her business in the next year. And she went back to the office and, as things invariably do, the next day, the managing partner, she worked at a law firm, of her law firm walked into her office. Like, this is, it's the equivalent of the CEO in a big company. And he walked into her office and he asked her if she would be on this new committee that was looking into making their library more technologically advanced. Mm-hmm. And she looked down at her business development plan and she took a big, deep breath and she said, I've spent a lot of time crafting this business development plan that I have, and I really want to devote whatever non-billable time, basically non-work-related time, to implementing that. And so I really can't do it this year. Mm-hmm. This request. And he smiled and he's like, good, because I actually think spending time on business development is a better use of your time than being on this committee, right?
Interesting.
And so she said, she was shocked, right? And
right.
So why did you ask me if you thought, this other thing was a better use of my time? And he's like, kind of shrugged his shoulders and he said, I thought you wouldn't say no, right? So
wow.
I think that this really, highlights the fact that oftentimes the person who's asking you, you're like not the only person in the organization who could do this or the only person who could help him accomplish this goal. Yeah. You're just the first person who walked down the hall, right? And so oftentimes saying no is not such a big deal to that person. Mm-hmm. We think they're going to be sitting there stewing about, like, why aren't you more of a team player and why don't you work harder and all of those kinds of things. And they're just like on to what I call next, right? Yeah. So that, that's one other thing that I think.
But before we move on, Sara, let me ask you a question about what happens when they don't respond in that way. Because my experience, it's wonderful when that happens, but my experience is often they'll ask again and it requires another no. And it's really the second no. You may get your script down for the first no, but it's the second no where they wear you down and give you their other reason. Like, please, I really need you to do this. And you got to have that second no prepared.
Okay. So I think that there's a couple of different alternatives there. So the first one is what I call the partial no. And it's, I can't do this thing right now, but I'll do it the next time you ask, because today's a particularly busy day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing you could say is, like, for example, I can't go to that meeting today, but I'm happy to review the minutes of it and give you some feedback about what I think the right course is here. So you're not getting them exactly what they want, but you're getting them some of what they want, right? You're showing that you're willing to help, but just not in this particular circumstance. There's what I call the not now no, which is I can't do it today, but if you ask me next week, I'd certainly consider doing it, right? So, like, I call it the not no now. Then there's the alternative no, which is my day is really jammed, but I think Susie can help you with this. Now, Susie may not be so thrilled about that, but oftentimes you can actually explain why Susie might actually be a good candidate, or even maybe a better. Susie's been working with that client in the past, so I think maybe she would have some value to add if she was the person who made the call. Or it might be, Susie has been talking to me about the fact she really wants to be promoted. And I think this is a developmental opportunity for her to, actually interact with the client in a way, to give them some bad news or to find out what their questions are or whatever it may be. So you kind of reframe it and say, I'm not the ideal person to do this. I can't do it right now, but she's a good substitute for that. So
great.
I think those are some alternatives, for what you call the second no.
I love that. Those are great ideas. And I'm going to write down for you guys who are watching later all of these great tips that Sarah's giving us and put them into the downloadable worksheet that will go with this episode, because this is really solid gold stuff, Sarah. I mean, knowing what to say and how to say it in a way that isn't necessarily a no, I can't do this, but is more softer versions of no. Let's look at my calendar and see when we can put together a time to meet about this, those kinds of future actions. And it reminds me also of one of the skills that I teach in Negotiate with Confidence around curiosity and asking a question around a deadline. So, I spent most of my career working with salespeople, and
they always want everything yesterday.
They want everything yesterday, right? So I learned, if I was going to be able to manage my schedule at all ever, to get curious and ask questions about these deadlines. And I often found, I would say 70 to 80% of the time, people just the people I was working with would just make up deadlines. So they would say, can you get this to me by tomorrow afternoon? And when I asked one question about what's happening tomorrow afternoon, or tell me a little bit more about this deadline, I would find out either that they had just made up the deadline because tomorrow afternoon sounded like a good time, or they needed maybe not the whole report that they were asking for, but just a summary because they needed to send a summary to the client by tomorrow afternoon. And suddenly this huge project that they had asked for by tomorrow afternoon becomes something that's manageable just by getting curious and asking a couple of questions.
Yes, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And what I want to sort of also talk about some ancillary benefits, which actually goes to the story I told about the managing partner, the woman who said no to the managing partner, which is that sometimes when you say no, it actually enhances your reputation because, first of all, people respect that you have boundaries, right? And that's kind of a leadership skill, right? To be able to be clear about what your yeses are and what your nos are. But the other thing is that oftentimes, especially if you articulate what your yes is, that's prohibiting what your no is. Let me get that right. What your yes is that's causing you to say no. they actually start looking at you in a new light. And in this particular case, the woman who said no to being on the library committee, basically that elevated her in the mind of the person she was talking to as somebody who was really serious about building her business, which, let's face it, was a much more important goal than bringing their library up into, being more technologically advanced. And so that person started thinking about her as the kind of person who is invested in growing her business as just another body who could work in the library committee. So I think that sometimes ancillary benefit of saying no to people. And in fact, another great book, which I love, is by Carolyn Webb. It's called How to Have a Good Day. And she talks about doing what she calls the positive no. And this really goes to the issue of like building your credibility for what you're invested in. Her formula is you begin it with warmth, which is, oh, I'm so thrilled that you asked me to do this. I'm honored. I'm delighted, whatever it may be. And then that you say what your yes is. And I would really love to help you on this project, but right now I'm really trying to land this new client. And that's taking all of my time. And it would be like really great if we could, for the firm, if we could get this new client because they're in the space we want to be in and whatever. Right. And then you say, so, I really can't go on that pitch with you because this is really how I'm spending my time. And then she says, you close with warmth. But I think the project you're working on is really great, and I wish you all the best. So it's this warmth, and sandwich in the between is your yes and your no. And so again, these are just ways that you can soften your no, but also to come across as somebody who's a serious business person. You're clearly invested in the future of the firm. You're invested in how things are, how the business is going to play out. And you're not just like lazy, which is what it's about, or contrary or whatever, not a team player.
That is solid gold right there, Sarah. I mean, that is all the reason you need to say no, is that saying no in this way. And I love that formula that you just shared. I was looking down here I have a book that I was going to hold up. Of course, I can't find it now, but it's like The Power of a Positive No, or it's a classic How to Say No book. And it follows a similar formula where you start with warmth and you're using your no to build a stronger connection with the other person. But you're also, what you just said is you're elevating your position. And instead of just being seen as a yes person all the time, you're seen as someone who is a serious player, a serious contributor, someone who is putting your time and effort into serious things. And that is, if that isn't your number one reason to be able to say no, I don't know what is, because we all want to be seen as more competent. We want to be seen as confident. We want to be seen as leaders. Even if you're not in a management role or striving to be in a management role, you still want to be perceived as a leader in whatever you're managing or working on your team.
Right.
And I think that really does it.
So I want to say one other thing about saying no, which is I think we often overestimate the impact that our saying no is going to have on the person who's making the request. And, my example of the managing partner is an example of that, which is he just moved on to the next person. But scientists call this, we have a harshness bias, which is that our tendency to believe that people will judge us much more negatively than they actually do. It's a real thing, right? Scientifically documented. And so oftentimes we, catastrophize what the impact of our saying no is, when in fact, in that person's day, it's just one more transaction that didn't go exactly as they wanted it to. So I think that that's important to remember too, is that sometimes it's so much more, our yes is so much more important than that no to that person, that we really do need to be conscious of how we're spending, about how willing we are to say yes.
That is a great place for us to end. I can't believe we've already been talking for 25 minutes. I feel like I could talk to you all day, which I can do. I actually can't talk to you, but I can listen to you. I have Sarah's podcast up on the screen. Sara has these kinds of conversations with amazing, smart, motivated, talented women from all different walks of life on her very inspiring podcast, Advice to My Younger Me, where you're going to get tons of great advice. And it's not just blah, 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 boring kind of stuff. It's like interactive, interesting, compelling conversations. So I really encourage you guys to check it out. Go listen to the podcast, subscribe. If you want to find Sara, you can find her here, which is To My Younger Me, To My Younger dot me. And it's up on your screen as well. Reach out to Sara if you have any questions or connections, and look on Negotiate with Confidence, melissahereford.com, to find the download that goes with this episode. I want to thank you, Sara, for joining us today. This was such an inspiring conversation. And I want to thank you for sharing your advice with all of us.
I'm delighted to have done it. I hope I actually have a challenge for people.
Oh, yeah. Let's hear it.
Yes. Which is, in the next week, I'd like you to go out and say no to 5 requests. Now, they don't have to be huge requests at all. This is all about exercising your no muscle. So it could be, when the waiter brings you the menu and says, do you want dessert? It could be, no, thank you, right? That counts as a no. Mm-hmm. And it could be when somebody says to you, hey, do you want to go and see this movie? And you don't want to see the movie, but you really like the person, to say, no, but I would be willing to do something else. And maybe it will be a big no, like something no to your boss. But basically, learning how to say no is really a skill. Mm-hmm. And one, we have to practice it. And secondly, we need to watch the reactions we get. Because going back to that last point I made about we often overestimate how devastating our no is going to be to people. Most of the times people are just like, okay. Move on.
I'll ask the next person. Yes. So everyone who's watching, exercise your no muscle. I love that. 5 times in the next week. There's your challenge. And shoot Sara and I a message or comment on this Facebook page if you're watching on the Facebook page about what you did and what happened, and we will respond.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sara.